Okay, good evening.
Hold your
Let
horses. Hold your horses.
All right. On that note, we're going to learn about Sanhedrin Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. We're going to discuss the Mishnah. We had this is a few days ago, last week's stuff. We're going to go back and discuss one of the three Isurim on the king. If you remember, the king had three no-nos in terms of limitations, in terms of women and money and horses. So today we're going to take a peek into the prohibition of horses. So the Mishnah says on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, I am on the top of the page of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, Lo Yarba Lo Susim, Ela Kedei Markavto. There isn't a number per se, like, we discussed 18 women or 18 wives, like, for David. There's no specific number, but the Mishnah says that the horses should only be at a reasonable rate. Okay, whatever he needs. Okay, let's see what the Gemara says about that. Tanu Rabbanan. And the rest of the Mishnah discusses Kesef and Zahav. We won't be discussing that or the Sefer Torah. I just want to focus on the prohibition of horses. So let's look at what the Gemara says. Tanu Rabbanan. Lo yarbe lo susim. The pasuk in Shoftim says, Lo yarbe lo susim. Yachol afilu kedei markavto paroshav. I would have thought that this prohibition is only meaning he could only have enough for his, what he needs for his chariot. Talmud lomar lo ein omar aval mar behu kedei rachba v'farashav. So he can have a lot for his for army purposes, but for his personal, and that's what we're going to focus in, is that it's low, meaning the stretch is on him personally. As Rashi says, mashma laharchiv daito ulahagdil, the ribususim. This is just he wants to show off. So he wants something that's completely unnecessary. So he has for himself personal horses. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says. So, Hamani Makayim Susim. So why does it say Lo Yarbilo Susim? So the Gemara says Susim Habatlanim. Okay, horses that he really has just to show off, but they're really not doing anything. They're just hanging around the stable, eating all day. So that's a prohibition. So minayin shafilu sus echad v'hu batel shehu b'lo yarbe. How do I know that if it's even one extra one that's not doing anything, it's just there just to show off? How do we know that that's in the prohibition of lo yarbe? Talmud lomar loman harbo sus. Okay, because it says the word even a sus, which is singular. So so why does the Torah have to repeat susim if you just told me that one sus is what's going to do it in for him? Why susim? Why plural? The Gemara says lavor belotase al kol sus v'sus, because each and every sus that is sitting and doing nothing, that itself is a no-no. Okay, very good. Now, let us skip a little bit, because before I dive into this, I want to just bring up one more point in the Gemara, and the rest is going to be like a Parsha class. That's how I wanted to develop this class tonight. It's going to be mostly on Psukim and Chumash. I want to spend a little bit more time on the Gemara. So the Gemara, if you skip down to 1, 2, 3, 4, it's the fourth wide line. Okay, we're on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. This happens to be a very famous piece because we're about to say something that everybody knows or everyone's heard about it, but no one knows exactly where it's located. So now we're going to give the secret where it's located. V'amar Rav Yitzchak mipnei malo nizgalu taimei Torah. Okay, what's the reason why why the Taimei HaTorah weren't given. Okay, that's what Rav Yitzchak says. Right? We don't know all the time the reasons for certain prohibitions. Right? We have a whole book that we learn every Tuesday called the Sefer HaChinuch that tries to give various explanations, but they're not really, you know, 100% accurate all the time. They're just they're just an opinion. We don't have concrete reasons given to us why certain prohibitions exist. Okay. And we always ask the question, well, why don't we know? Why don't we know? Right? Or why can't we know? Why is it hidden from us? So the Gemara answers, Shahare Shtei Mikros Nisgalu Taiman Nichshal Behen Gadol Ha'olam. Gemara says, because we tried it. Okay. Meaning we gave two experiments. And the problem is when you give a reason, and we discussed this in previous classes, when we spoke about the end of Metzia, where it talks about Dorish Taimei Dekra, if you remember, Rav Shimon is Dorish Taimei Dekra. He tries to understand the reason behind everything, right? So that was, we spoke about that once, and we tied this in a little bit over here also. But we're about to bring that Shlomo HaMelech, Ksiv lo yarba lo nashim. Shlomo said, I am not worried. You're dealing with the champion, right? The most intellectually gifted person of his time, Shlomo HaMelech. He says, don't worry about it. Ani arbe v'lo aser. I will marry women as many as I want, and this prohibition does not apply to me. Okay? This is like when you tell our children, don't do something for a certain reason, and they want to know why, and we don't want to tell them, because if you tell them why, they'll try to weasel out of it and try to give an excuse why it doesn't apply to them. And Shlomo did the same thing. What happened in the end to Shlomo? Vahila es zikna Shlomo nashav hitu es livo. Right? When he got older, he had so many women that they were a bad influence on him. Okay, uksiv, and then the second no that Shlomo was over, it says lo yarba lo susim v'amar Shlomo ani arbe v'lo ashiv uksiv atetze merkavim mitzrayim b'sheish. So Shlomo says there's I know the Torah talks about not having too many susim. I'm different, and I'm not going to be over. So the question is what? So up until now, we don't know why the prohibition exists of horses, too many horses. But the Torah at the end links, and this is what we're going to talk about extensively, is this link between Mitzrayim and horses. There's something special about horses that will draw the king back to Mitzrayim. That's what the pasuk says. So Shlomo says, I'm different. And unfortunately, he learned the hard way that he wasn't different, because it says that he went back and he did business and he did a lot of deals with horses going back to Egypt. And he sinned by going back to Egypt. So that's how the Gemara ends. What the Gemara does not discuss over here is the second half of the problem, which is the reason. Meaning we just explained, or Yitzchak just explained, that we don't like to give reasons, right? And if you think that it's for no reason, no pun intended, there's a good reason why we can't give reasons, which is we tried it once and Shlomo failed, right? So we want to keep the reasons hidden so people don't wiggle around it and try to say, well, this doesn't apply to me. And that's what, in the end, was Shlomo's demise. So what it doesn't discuss over here is the prohibition of going back to Egypt. So let us look at that prohibition. Okay? I want to start. There's a lot to talk about. And like I said, most of the discussion is from Psukim, and you're going to be enlightened as to, sometimes we breeze through these psukim and we don't really understand a lot of it, or we don't realize that there's major, major discussions and differences amongst commentators on what the shot of the pasuk is. Sometimes we go deep and with pilpul and everything, and we're all over the place. Here, we're going to see examples where the Ferish of Psukim can be really interpreted different ways according to which Meforish you like better. So we're going to start with, as we always do, we're going to start with the Sefer HaChinuch. We are doing mitzvah number almost 500. We'll get to that in a minute. We're doing mitzvah number 499. Okay, 499 talks about the Isser of horses. So let's look at number 499 in the Chinuch. Okay, 1 second. Let me open it up. Shoftim. Shelo yarba hamelach susim. Shelo yarba lo hamelach shimlo chaleinu susim zulasi hatzricha l'merkavto u'merkevas parashav. Okay, so far it's what we just said in Sanhedrin, that the king that is ruling currently can't have too many horses for himself, except for what he actually needs for his chariots that he takes out for war and for the chariots of his horsemen. Okay, so again, it's the personal ones that belong to him that are a problem. The inyan hamitzvah shelo yihiyeh lo susim sheirutzu lefanav l'chavod ba'alma. So the Chinuch says, the reality is that we don't want him just to have horses that are just there for decoration. They're just going and running and just, to give him honor. Even if he has one extra horse that is deemed unnecessary, he is over this. However, if he has horses that are hanging out in his stable, preparing, that are used for war, just in case, right, war breaks out, right? And sometimes he needs them, and sometimes he's going to need them for his people, for his horsemen to ride on. That's not in the prohibition, because those are what we call emergency horses. It's only on what we said. You can't have extra horses that are just idling around. He should have only one animal, okay, besides his merkava that he has. Okay, he's allowed basically one for himself and one spare. Okay, it's like your car, right? You have one for yourself and one insurance in case it breaks down. Now, what's interesting is that the Chinuch says, so the Chinuch usually gives a reason that the Torah doesn't give. Here, this is ironic because the Torah itself gives a reason. So the Chinuch is saying, you don't need me to tell you, because the pasuk itself says the reason, because because it's going to lead back the people to going to Egypt. Because the more horses you have, the more prone you're going to what? You're going to be more prone to go back and settle in Mitzrayim, okay, and ride horses there. Because the prohibition is going to Egypt permanently. So if you go into some kind of deal or business where you are breeding horses, okay, and you end up like in America, the horse capital of the world is probably I'd say Lexington, Kentucky, right? So if you're doing business, chances are you're going to end up being in either Louisville, Lexington, somewhere in Kentucky. You're going to be going there a lot. All right. So that's where the capital is. So too the capital at that time was Egypt, and the Psukim and Sanhedrin, already said that because that's where Shlomo bought the horses from. So you're going to end up going back to Mitzrayim. That's what the Chinuch says the reason is. Okay, we're going to see what that means. That means that we don't want you to settle there forever. You could go there for business. The gam shelo yarum levavo baharbos lo susim v'kesev v'zahav ki asusim l'rov yafyam v'kalosam yiskau behen adonehen. Right? He gives maybe a second side reason. He says that it's also that you shouldn't get too proud. Right? A little bit too much gaiva is no good. Right? You're going to have a few extra horses that you don't need. You'll get a little too bubbly in the head, and you're going to have too much, and that's no good, right? So you're going to be too proud of their beauty, right? It says, Yiska'u bahen adonehem. You're going to be too proud of these horses. You're going to be proud of their beauty and their speed. Okay, so that's what he says. And he ends off by saying, and if you're over this, if the king is over this, you are Melecha over al zeh, v'hosef afilu sus echad, right? Panoi lehios ratz lefanav, chayiv malchus. You're chayiv malchus if you are over this. Okay, so that's one thing. Now the setup is mitzvah number 500. Okay, because all of this was to guard you against 499 is there to guard you against 500. Now, you should already be asking, because we had this concept in Bava Basra Peches, if you remember, about 6-7 weeks ago, we spoke about weights and measures. And if you remember that it was the opinion of someone, I forgot already, that the whole concept of not having false weights and measures in your house, it was just a geder. It was just a safeguard against using it and tricking people, right? If you remember that whole discussion we had about what if you have weights and measures in your house that are incorrect and you don't use them, right? Are you still over for lo yeva beischa even va'aven, right? Gedola ktana even shlema, right? Are you over that even shlema lav if you just have them and keep them as mementos and you don't actually use them? Say, well, you're not tricking anyone, so why in the world would you be liable if you're not using it? So that the answer is that's exactly what the chiddush is, because the whole reason why is just in case. So we called that, right? We call that a safeguard, right? Sometimes you can't do X because we don't want you to do Y, right? The most famous example that we gave at that time was, according to some opinions, the prohibition of basar v'chalav only exists so that you shouldn't eat basar v'chalav, right? That's why you can't cook it together, just in case you come to eat it. If you don't cook basar v'chalav together, then chances are you're never going to eat basar v'chalav. So, right? So that's why the Maggid Mishnah says that the whole prohibition is just a safeguard, is just a geder, not to come to eating it. So too over here, the whole prohibition of not having horses is just a guard against not going back to Egypt. So that's why the two are really inextricably linked. So that's the concept of having this geder. So now let's look at number 500. Okay, number 500. Shelo lishkon be'eretz Mitzrayim la'olam. Okay, Shelo nosif lashu b'derech Mitzrayim la'olam. Says the chinuch, the prohibition is not going back to Egypt, meaning klomar shelo nelech likboa dirasenu b'Mitzrayim. Okay, you have to be very careful how you read it. I.e., right, you can't be koveya, your main resident in Mitzrayim. Okay? how do we define main residence? Do we do the 180 days like we do in New York? No, this has nothing to do with 180 days. This is just forever. That's what the prohibition is. Okay, as the pasuk that we just said. And the truth is, this is not just a one and done pasuk. This is repeated 3 times in the Torah. We're going to see that in a minute. Okay, okay. What's the reason? Well, I stopped over there because I'm going to show you the Yerushalmi that actually shows you where these 3 places are. But the chinuch, we're going to go right to the reason. What is wrong with living, and I say living as opposed to going, what is wrong with living in Mitzrayim? So we're going to see a couple of reasons. The first and foremost reason, which is pretty unanimous by all of the, you know, all the Tamei HaMitzvos commentators, is Lefisha Anshe Mitzrayim Ra'im V'Chataim. Okay, people in Mitzrayim are historically wicked people and sinners. V'ha'el Baruch Hu hotzianu misham, uga'alnu b'chasadav miyadam l'zakosenu l'lechetz b'darchei ha'emes. And God took us out of there, okay, to give us the chus, to find darchei emes. V'ratza b'tuvo hagadol aleinu, l'bilti nashuv od lihitameh b'tocham. So therefore it makes sense, if it's a bad place, that God would not want us to go back, to return, to be metame, to defile ourselves amongst them, kidei shelo nilmad kefiro sehen, so that we shouldn't learn their wicked agenda, which is kefira. V'lo nelech b'darchehem hamugunaim etzel torasenu hashlema. Okay, so that's that we don't want to go there, and we don't want to learn from their wicked ways, their disgusting ways, compared to our perfect ways of the Torah. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit more in the Sefer HaChinuch, and he says, "V'noag isur zeh b'chol makom, v'orval zeh v'kaved dirasa sham over alav zeh, aval ein loken alav zeh." So here's an interesting number 499. The king, if he has too many horses, he gets malchus. But what's interesting, right? The whole reason why the horse prohibition is just for number 500, right? It exists just because of we don't want to go back to Mitzrayim. So it's ironic how you do get malchus for the horses, but you don't get malchus for living in Egypt. Why is that? So the chinuch says, "Lefi she'ein bo ma'isa." It's a lav she'ein bo ma'isa. Lefi she'b'shas ha'knisa muterhu. He says because as soon as you go there, and by the way, this gets very, very, very lumdish. I'm not going to talk about the lumdishosity of this right now, but you could hear that there's a lot going on over here in terms of the din of malchus and a din of whether or not this is considered a Maisa. But the point that the chinuch says is that as soon as you go there and you cross the border, you're not living there right away. You're just in. Ubihistako sham ein bo Maisa. And then when you decide to say, hey, I like it here, then you already came in already. So therefore, there's no Maisa, you like this? There's no Maisa technically when you're there for a while. Okay, so that is the Sefer HaChinuch on the mitzvah of horses and the mitzvah of going back to Egypt. So the one who made this famous, obviously, was none other than the Rambam. So being that the Rambam lived in Mitzrayim, let's see what the Rambam has to say about this halacha. Okay. Now, where is this halacha found about going to Mitzrayim? Well, because it stemmed from horses and kings, you're going to find it in Hilchas Malachim. And all the way at the end of Hilchas Malachim in the fifth perek of Hilchas Malachim talks about Amalek, and it talks about killing and wartime rules, and amongst the rules of how to act in war, and regarding kibush rabim, and all kinds of other interesting halachos. The Rambam says in Halacha Zayin, umuter lishkon b'chol ha'olam chutz me'eretz Mitzrayim. So I found it I didn't see any commentaries on this, but it's interesting how he begins. So obviously you could live, maybe not so obviously, but he says, don't worry, the whole planet is okay to live, right? As if we need a heter, right? I actually did see, there was a comment by let me just look it up. There was a comment by the Migdal Oz, right? The Migdal Oz was a commentator on the Rambam. There's a legend that says that it was a woman, that's where the name of the girls' yeshiva came from. Not for now, but anyway, the Migdal Oz says Zil Krebe Ravu. The fact that the Rambam had to start off by saying that you could live anywhere on earth, we don't need a Rebbe to tell you that, because that's obvious. So he's kind of like wondering, like, why is the Rambam telling me that Mitzrayim is a problem, but the whole world is okay? Okay, something on the side to deal with. Anyways, min hayam hagadol v'ad ha'ma'arav arbamos parsa keneged eretz kushu keneged hamidbar. Now, if you want to know what's included in Mitzrayim, if you look at the atlas today, that's not exactly the Mitzrayim that was around by the time of the Rambam. The borders obviously changed. Now, he gives a dimension of 400 parsa by 400 parsa. That comes from several Gemaras that, according to most, from what I remember, aren't to be taken literally, because nothing could be exactly 400 by 400. It's a very, very large area. Okay, that's where Egypt at least was. Keneged Eretz Kush. Now, Kush is, if you look up Kush in Wikipedia, it'll tell you that the Kush kingdom spanned from what is today basically Sudan all the way up Egypt. So it's much bigger. Now, we think of Kush as Ethiopia. It's not exactly Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is, I think on the map, is a little bit southeast of Sudan. But anyways, the boundaries the Rambam give is much bigger than it is today. But he says, Hakol Asur Lihisyashiv Shem. I don't want to get caught up on the geography, but basically what was then considered Egypt is completely, the Rambam says, off limits. And then he goes on to say, B'shoshu Makomos is here a Torah, and he's going to quote the psukim that we're going to see. So basically, the Rambam, who himself lived in Egypt, said it's off limits. The whole country, you cannot live there. However, if you go to the next, okay, if you go to number 8, if you go to Halacha Ches, he says, Mutar lachzor le'eretz Mitzrayim l'schoru u'leprakmatya. When can you go back? You could go back for business, okay, trade and commerce. Ulichvosh artzos acheros. Okay? Ve'ein asur elo lihishtakei sham. Or if you want to go pass through it, right? You want to colonize. I don't know if you could use that word, but I'm going to use it anyway. You want to colonize other countries in Africa, okay? And you pass through Egypt. You are absolutely allowed to do that. Ve'ein asur elo lihishtakei sham. The problem is settling there permanently. Okay, it sounds like Nile cruises and Sphinx tours are absolutely permitted from this Rambam. Okay, and he says she'ein bo maisa. Again, he goes back to this problem, or the reason why you can't. Why there's no problem is that there's no what we call maisa, right? There's no real, maisa that you're doing. V'yir ali. Okay, the Yirali, the Rambam says a chiddush, right? Whenever the Rambam says Yirali, that means that he's not getting any support from the Gemara. This is his own personal opinion. She'im kavash eretz Mitzrayim melech Yisrael al pi bezdin shehi muteres. What if Israel decides to colonize Egypt and we go and conquer Egypt? Is that permitted? He says if it's done with the approval of the Bezdin, which today is a moot point because we don't have a Bezdin. The Knesset doesn't count. So if we decide to wage war and take over the country of Mitzrayim, that wouldn't count. But if we had a Bezdin, says the Rambam, that would be absolutely mutter. No debate. V'lo hisira ela lashuv la yechidim o lishkon ba. V'hi biyad akum. Okay, the only prohibition is for people individually to settle there, okay, while it is still under Egyptian rule. Says the Rambam. What now he goes into his reason. What's the reason? Okay, and he's going to say very similar to what the Chinuch said, because it is the lowest form of society. Okay, Shenemar Kemase Eretz Mitzrayim. If you remember the end of Achrei Mos, that talks about right the what we learn at the end of Yom Kippur on Mincha and Mincha time. It says Kamase Eretz Mitzrayim. Right before the Arayas, it says, I'm going to tell you all the Arayas just to let you know what you shouldn't do, okay, like you once knew in Eretz Mitzrayim, right? You're going into Eretz Yisrael. You cannot act like you witnessed in the land of Mitzrayim. Okay, that is really the end of the Rambam. Now, we're not going to discuss now, but obviously probably one of the most famous questions on earth that exist on the Rambam per se is how could he say this if we all know that he lived there and there's very many reasons given. We will explore a few as we go along. So again, so we started off in Sanhedrin. Okay, so we got the Chinuch and we have the Rambam. So our Gemara actually didn't talk about the prohibition of living in Egypt. It talked about the prohibition of horses, right? So is there at all a Gemara that says that, yes, I mean, we saw the Chinuch, we saw the Rambam, but which Gemara actually points out the problem of living in Mitzrayim? Okay, and for that, we need to go to Meseches Sukkah. Why in the world would this be in Meseches Sukkah? Because toward the end of Meseches Sukkah, the last perek, the very famous Mishnah that talks about the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Okay, our favorite activity on Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara over there talks about how great the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, right? It says, Misha lo ra Simchas Beis HaShoeva, lo ra Simcha b'yamav. Okay, and then it talks about other things that if you never saw this particular thing, you've never witnessed a simcha in your life. Then it says, if you never saw Yerushalayim in all its splendor, you never saw a city like this, if you never saw this, if you never saw that. And the Gemara goes on a little bit of a side tangent and says, Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mishalo Ra'a, Duflustun Shal Alexandria Shal Mitzrayim. If you never saw, it's a Greek word, right? The Greek word for synagogue, which itself is Greek. But if you never saw the famous synagogue in Alexandria, in Egypt, right? You never saw a building like this in your life. You've never saw the kavod of Yisrael. And it talks about how great the synagogue was. Amru Kamin Basilki, it was like a basilica. It was stav, lifnim stav, paim shahayuba, kiflaim kiyotze Mitzrayim. He says it was so big, the synagogue in Alexandria, there were 1.2 million people that could be there at the same time, whatever that means. Not sure if it's an exaggeration or not. There were 71 gold bars. Keneged the 71 on Sanhedrin Gedola, right? It goes on and on to talk about the construction, and talked about there was a bima in the middle. Okay, that's the whole right? That's the whole controversy about the bima in the middle, the bima in the front. This is one of the earliest sources that the bima is in the middle of the shul. Not for now. It talks about the chazan, haKnesses. There were so many people that they had to announce what page they were on, that they would have flags so that everyone could see what where are we going with this? If we skip to all the way at the end of that Gemara, it says after 7 lines of extolling the virtues of this beautiful shul in Alexandria, it says Amar Abaya the kulhu katlinu Alexandros muktam. The whole thing, everybody was killed out. That was destroyed. Everyone died at the hands of Alexander the Great. Now, before we get to the reason why it was destroyed, the Bezalel Ranchberg and the Gra are very quick to say it wasn't the Alexander the Great because the timeline doesn't match up. Again, not for now. But why were they destroyed? My time at Iyanshu Mishum Da'avri Haikra, because the people were over the following pasuk, Lo Sosifu Nashu B'derech Hazeh Od. You can't go back to Egypt. The Inhu, and the fact that there was a thriving community in Alexandria with at least 1 million people. Again, if you take the Gemara literally, there were 1.2 million people that at least went to shul, right? And then there's probably another shul that was there that people didn't go to, right? Like the joke. So could you imagine how many people lived in Alexandria?
Wasn't
right?
there another shul? There was this breakaway base of Mikdash that the brother of the Kohen Gadol built.
Right. That's at the end of Zvachim. All right. The
Base Ono.
Base Ono. Right. The base Onyo. Right. Yes. So you could imagine how many people lived in Alexandria. So what is everyone doing there that shouldn't be there? So according to Abaya, that's why they were killed. Now, I looked high and low. For the obvious question is, last we checked, it may be an Isser. I don't know if you're, Chayiv Misa. This isn't one of the, the sins that you get a capital punishment for. Okay, so that needs to be, that's a separate, discussion about why we so machmir, and like there are obviously other reasons why they were destroyed. It sounds like this is probably one out of many, but it's certainly a proof, and I believe this is the only reference that there is about a punishment or this prohibition, not horse related. Again, this is not horse related. This is a prohibition separately of living in Egypt. So in terms of just an introduction now, to get to the 3 places, let's look at the Yerushalmi that we saw a little bit in the Chinuch. It's the Yerushalmi in Sukkah. The Yerushalmi in the 5th parak of Sukkah that is mentioned right after this story. Tani Reb Shimon ben Yochai, b'shloshim makomos huzuri Yisrael shelo lashuv eretz Mitzrayim. Shenemar ki kasher reitem es Mitzrayim hayom lo tosifim l'rosan od ad olam. Okay, so now we're going to fill in the clues. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says there are 3 places where the prohibition is written. The first one is in Parshas Bishalach that I just read, Ki asher isem es Mitzrayim hayom lo tosifim l'rosan ad olam, which is a strange way of saying you can't go to Egypt. Okay. Then v'Hashem amar lachem lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh od. The second one is from our Gemara in Sanhedrin Chaf Aleph in Parshas Shoftim that says God said you can't return to this by this way to Egypt. Again, if you interpret it literally, that's what the pasuk in Shoftim says. And what's the third, which is the more obscure reference, right? We always get 2 of them, but the third one is a very hard one. Only if you're a Bal Korah, you would know the third reference. V'heshivcha Hashem Mitzrayim ba'aniyos. Okay, all the way at the end of the Tochacha, after everyone's out of breath, right? Reading the Tochacha, right, for 7 minutes straight in Parshas Kisavo. It says, I'm going to send you back to Egypt in boats. Okay. Ubishloshtan chazru, ubishloshtan naflu. Yerushalmi ends in a very, very tragic way. It says, it there are three azharos, and we were over it three times. And each time we went back, we suffered. Echad b'mei Sancheiriv melech Ashur, once in the days of Sancheiriv, shenemer hoy hayordim Mitzrayim la Ezra, okay, maksiv basrei Mitzrayim adam v'lo el b'suseim basar, okay, without going into it, we went in the times of Sancheiriv, and we all know what happened with Sancheiriv. V'achas b'mei Yochanan ben Kareach, whoever that was, v'haisa hacher v'asher etem yirei mimena sham tasig etchem, v'achas b'mei Tragianos Harasha. We don't have time to talk about him, but Trojanus, that was his Greek name. This was right before the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. There was another story where we went back to Egypt. We don't have time to go through all the history, but if you want to look it up, it is the Yerushalmi in Sukkah in the beginning of the 5th chapter. Okay, that's where you could start your research from. So what I'd like to do in the last 20 minutes is actually spend some time on these psukim that we see all the time and probably have no idea how complicated they are when you open up the hood, because they seem simple. Like, for example, let's start off with a pasuk that we quoted from Sanhedrin Chaf Aleph. It says, "Rak lo yarbe lo susim v'lo yashiv es ha'am Mitzrayma laman harbo sus v'Hashem amar lechem lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh od." So there's two real problems with this pasuk. The first pasuk is, I'll say it slow, "Rak lo yarbe lo susim v'lo yashiv es ha'am Mitzrayma." If you read it literally, it says, however, he shouldn't have too many horses, nor shall he bring the nation back to Egypt. Okay? So it sounds like they're kind of independent. That's the first problem. And the second problem is, the end of the pasuk says, "V'hasher amar lachem lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh od." Right? And God told you, by the way, you can't go back that way again. So when did God tell us? It's one thing if we're creating a new Isser, that would be okay. Don't go back to Mitzrayim. We may not understand why. It may not make sense, but whatever. Put that on the list of other things we don't understand. Not a big deal. What is going on over here? Since when were we told by God that there's an Isser? So says Rashi, Lo yarba lo susim. Let's tackle the first problem first. Lo yarba lo susim ela kedei merkavto shelo yashiv es ha'am Mitzrayim. Rashi adds in a shet, right? Again, very, very subtle over here. Lo yarba lo susim, don't add too many horses, so that shet shelo yashiv es ha'am Mitzrayim. Okay, as a precaution. Why? Because horses come from there, and we all know that Shlomo went to Mitzrayim to do business, and that was his downfall. Okay, so that's Rashi. Now, we've seen many Ibn Ezras that are very, very difficult, not difficult to understand, but kind of like flip everything from what the Pashat Pshat is. The Ibn Ezra says, respectfully, Lo tosifun mitzvah haisa v'lo nichtava. I don't know how many people have ever seen this Ibn Ezra, but he's basically saying, yeah, there's a commandment. It was never written down, though, meaning it was never given to us. So the Ibn Ezra says, don't think too much. There's nothing really to think about. It's possible that we were given commandments and it just wasn't written down. Now, that's very, very difficult for a lot of people to understand. He does end up saying the yesh omrim. He does give a yesh omrim. Mitam lo tosifin l'rosam od ad olam. He says, if you really push me, I'll tell you, some say that we were told in Parshas Bishalach, which we all know is another reference. So yes, the Ibn Ezra does admit, but he ends off by saying, v'zos derech acheres. But that has a different meaning. Meaning it may not mean what you think it means. So that's, very, very, my opinion at least, in Ibn Ezra, that we probably just pass over, but he's basically saying, sorry, Rashi, I don't agree. We weren't given this commandment. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that it wasn't written down anywhere. Okay, that's that. And if that wasn't enough, the Chizkuni actually doubles down, and he says, and he quotes the Ibn Ezra. He says, "Mitzvah haisa v'lo nechtava." The Chizkuni actually says exactly like the Ibn Ezra. There's a fascinating Nitziv, and this deserves a lot more time than I'm going to give it. But the Nitziv, let me just read it quickly. The Nitziv says on this pasuk, a lot of sources tonight. The Nitziv says, "Kvar perish harishon of Shuhu Mikroshev Parshas Bishalach Lo Tusif L'Rosam Od Olam." So he says basically, what the Yesh Omrim in the Ibn Ezra says, that most people accept that our initial prohibition that God is reminding us in Parshas Shoftim refers to the pasuk in Parshas Bishalach. He says, "V'kachkasa barabba Megillas Esther b'shem Reb Shimon ben Yochai b'gimel makomos." He says, "V'lo she'ikar pashta dekrahu la'azhara." He says it's not that the pashat pshat is that this is an azhara. The vadai enu ela havtacha, right? The pasuk in Bishalach, if we get to it, is not a azhara. It's an havtacha. What's the context? Their backs are against the wall, and Moshe is saying, "Don't worry about it. We'll have another miracle. Why not?" Right? Not only that, you'll never see them again. So the big debate amongst the commentators is that a havtacha or is that an azhara? So the Hemek does. So the Nitziv says that's a havtacha. Rak lamadnu Moshe Rabbeinu b'shem Hashem sheyesh ba'oso mikra kavana shniya. But through Moshe Rabbeinu taught us that sometimes there's what we call a kavanah shniya, a second intent. There's two ways, like we say, tzvei dinim, right? In the world of the briskas, this is like tzvei dinim. There's two altered, right? I don't want to say alternate truth, but there's something else going on. There's a second intent, shehu azhara gamken. V'hainu lashon v'Hashem amar lachem v'ilu hayakach pasher hamikra lo haya nitzvach lefarishachi, right? Ela mishum she'eno lefi hapshat hutzrachno lomadnu sheyesh b'davar od kavanah shniya. We're forced, and the Ibn Ezra says something very revolutionary. I'm sorry, the Nitziv says something very revolutionary over here. He says that because we're forced to say this, because there's no other way of understanding it. Sometimes, if something looks mysterious and we can't figure it out, Allah the Ibn Ezra saying, "I don't know what this pasuk means because we were never commanded." The answer is, says the Nitziv, there has to be a way to explain it. So there has to be a second alternative from the mashmos. Hainu od hapam. Because it doesn't make sense, it's almost like you have no other choice but to say that there's something else going on, and there's a second way of learning the pasuk. Okay, that's very, very, very avant-garde by the Nitziv to say, because it doesn't apply everywhere. So you have to be very, very careful. The Ramban, by the way, being that we mentioned Rashi and the Ibn Ezra, just the Ramban discusses, let me open it up. Okay, the Ramban says, Lo yarba lo susim. He quotes Rashi, and then he says, V'huk shali bazeki amar b'Yushalmi b'sof Sanhedrin. Hold on a second. We saw this already. And he says, I don't like Rashi's pshat, who links this to going back to Egypt, because doesn't the Yerushalmi say that you can't go for good? I mean, for forever? Remember we said you could go for business, or if you're a tour guide to make money, as long as you're not there forever. So ask the Ramban, "V'im yishlach hamelech v'yikne misham susim v'harechev, schori zehu muter." This is a question we may have asked ourselves. I don't understand. What are horses about? Right? It's about business. It's about buying something. I thought, the Ramban asks, that it was permitted to go for business. So why is buying horses a prohibition if business is okay? So he says, "V'yitachen shederach hakasuv ki hiser lo yarba lo susim afilu ma'artzo me'eretz shinar." He says, what makes sense to me is that the azhara should be even if you buy it from Bavel or from Shinar, right? We had Shinar also in the Gemara a few days ago, right? No matter where you buy it from, if you bought it from Jordan and Lebanon, right? Now, horses also, by the way, are Lubim, came from Libya, right? The Gemara talks about that. That Libya was also a center for a horse trade, right? So it sounds like, right? It's not just Egypt. No matter where you get them from, it also should be a problem. Oh, but derech schara hamutara shal yiftach al richvo ki rav al parasha ki yatzum ma'od aval yiheh miftacho b'shem elokav. Right? You should believe in God, not in the horses. V'achar kach hizer al hamelech shal yashav es al mitzrayma sheyu lo sham me'avadav v'miyam asari mikna. Okay, so basically, the Ramban, because of his question, he kind of delinks this whole prohibition of Egypt to horses because, after all, business trade is okay. There are actually a number of answers on this question of the Ramban. One is from the Maharal, and one is from the Mizrahi. I'll read the Mizrahi just for time's sake. The Mizrahi says, because the Mizrahi brings up a lot of other good points. Let's see what the Mizrahi says. Hang on. Here we go. Mizrahi, he says, Einzo Kushya. I don't like this question that the Ramban asks. That's if you have schora, that's derech arai, temporary. But if you set up like a real business, permanent business, lo hutter klal, that's not permitted. Okay, so that's one way he answers the question. And because he answers this question, we're going to talk a few minutes about another point he brings up. He says, I got a bigger problem. He says, hasmag. He says, what about the smag? He says, who's the smag? Sefer Mitzvos Gedolos, right? What was his question? He says, I got bigger fish to fry. Forget about horses. We have millions of people living in Egypt. We have communities, we have shuls, we have probably Chabads, right? What happened to those? What happened to the Yisr? And if that wasn't enough, the Gam Rabbeinu Moshe Bar Maimon Halach Sham Lagur, right? He lived there. He was a doctor. So when in doubt, when it comes to a historical or geographical problem, we always have a out with Mr. Sancheiriv, right? I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek, but if you remember the Gemara in Brachos on Chaf, I think Zion talks about that. There's a story about Minyamin Ger HaMitzri, and we don't know who Mitzrim are today. We don't know who Ammon and Moav are today because Sancheiriv mixed up the whole world when he conquered. So all bets are off, right? The Gemara, various places in Shas uses that as a excuse, right? So maybe you want to use that excuse also, and also Gam Mitzrayim Nisbalbala, right? And he brings the Gemara, and there's Gemara in Maseches Yadayim we're not going to talk about. But anyways, so he says, he quotes our Gemara in Sukkah about the people in Alexandria, and he says, the problem is, he says, I don't know if I buy that because the story of Alexandria and the synagogue came after the Bilbul of Sancheiriv. So if you're right, that Sancheiriv, after Sancheiriv all bets are off, it's not true because they got punished, right? They said that Alexander the Great or whoever Alexander pick your Alexander, came and killed everyone, but that was after the Bilbul of Sancheiriv. He says that Teretz Bezesha Ein Lanu Tam Nachol Nahatir Im Lo Nefarish Keperish Harav Rabbi Lezer Mimitz. He says because we're stuck, all roads lead to the famous answer of Rabbi Lezer Mimitz, i.e., Mr. Yereim, She'amar Lo Tosifu Lo Asra Torah Ela B'derech Hazeh. If you actually analyze the words, it says, Vashem amar lachem lo tosifu mashuv b'derech hazeh. There's a certain way that you can't go back, meaning you can't retrace, right, the biblical way of going. But if you take a flight and you stop in Cyprus, or if you go through Istanbul, or if you go a certain way that wasn't the biblical way of leaving Mitzrayim, which we're not going to talk about now, how exactly they left, where it was. We could talk about Saudi Arabia, but not for now. But anyways, says Rabbi Lezer Mimitz, it is only if you follow the path that is the biblical path. Aval mishar aratzos mutar v'nachonu. The Mizrahi ends off by saying, you have nothing to worry about because you have to replicate, right? You have to go in like order reverse. You have to go exactly back the way you came. And that's pretty impossible because we can't even agree on what way that was. So that's the one way, says Rabbi Lezer Mimitz, that everybody has an out. There is an extremely controversial Rabbeinu Bachai that we must see because the Rabbeinu Bachai says, Azoi, he says, Hashem amar lachem lo tosifu mashu b'derech hazeod. He says, Zo mitzvah l'sha'a k'dei shelo yilmudu Yisrael masehen. There's no question at all in anybody. Because in the world of Rabbeinu Bachya, this mitzvah is only temporary. Now, this is very, very controversial because every Monei HaMitzvah lists this in their count. There's not one who doesn't list this. The problem is the Rabbeinu Bachai says that this is only temporary, okay? And it was only given so that we wouldn't learn from their Maasehen. Ulefisha hayu ha-mitzrim nodin umufarsamim b'chol toeva, because when it came to Mitzrayim, they were king of toevas, right? As the Rambam quotes and everyone else quotes, Kamaseret Mitzrayim, lakach tziva lahem ken. Ve'eno mitzvah ledoros. This is not a forever mitzvah. Shia asur hakasav adir b'Mitzrayim le'olam, that you can't live there forever. Now, what's his proof? This is an unbelievable thing I'm going to say. This is so unbelievable. I can't even believe it when I saw it. What's the Rabbeinu Bachai's proof that this is only temporary? He says, because look, everyone's doing it. He says, V'harei anu ro'in kama kihilos dora sham ma'az ve'ad hayom. Millions of people Jews have lived in Egypt from time immemorial until today. V'ilu haisa mitzuy ledoros. And if this was in fact a forever mitzvah, Luhai Yisrael Kadosh and Makilin Bezel Adur Sham. Nobody would have the chutzpah to violate something that's so clear. So what he's doing is, and I hope you all appreciate how far he's going, right, on a limb to exonerate and excuse us for living, is he's proving from a negative. He's saying it can't be that this is a mitzvah ledoros because everybody's being over it. So when I read this, it kind of reminded me of, there's two things that are like mysterious, right? Birkas Kohanim in America today. No one could really understand why they don't do it, right? It's not that, oh, they do it in Israel, and it's supposed to be done everywhere. The exception is Chutz La'aretz. Most people, except Sfardim and some other rabbis, when they have the daughter's bat mitzvah, decide to do it on their own. But most normal kehilos do not do Birchas Kohanim, okay, in Chutz La'aretz. And what's the answer? The answer is nobody really knows, right? There's a concept of Chadash, right, that people don't do either, and it applies outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? But because so many people are over it, we're like, okay, it must not be important. So what we have to do is we have to kind of like, bend over backwards to figure out how come it doesn't apply. because everyone is doing it. So this is like what's going on over here. He's proving that it's only mitzvah l'shah because everyone is doing it. So nobody would have the chutzpah to be over something that's so glaringly usher. Unbelievable. The ilu asaken hayu chacham shebechol dover dor mochin biyadam. I missed the punchline. He says, and if there was a problem, then the chachamim should have been doing something to stop it. So because no one cares about it and people just do it and pretend that it doesn't exist, it must mean that it's only temporary. Okay? And then he brings in v'yesovim shemitzvahs doras haya avalo asar hakasav hadira b'mitzrayim el osin shabayin sham eretz Yisrael. Okay, as we saw. I want to just end by, it's 9 o'clock already. I wanted just another 5 minutes, if you don't mind. There's just an unbelievable Chassam Sofer that I saw in Parshas B'Shalach, right? What's the second? The second is Vayomer Moshe El Ha'am Al Tira'u Hisyatzu Urus Yeshuas Hashem Asher Yasa Lachem Hayom Ki Asher Isem Mitzrayim Hayom Lo Tosifin Los Od Ad Holam. So we had the debate already whether this was an Ashara or whether this was a Havtacha, right? So now the two are not synonymous. Is it a guarantee or is it a prohibition? Those two words are not really synonymous. So the Chassam Sofer says, Mashma shehi havtacha. It sounds, from the context, if you're reading it, right, again, their backs are against the wall. Moshe says, don't worry, you're never going to see them anymore, right? That sounds like a guarantee to alleviate their fear that they're going to get slaughtered by the Yam Suf. Says the Chassam Sofer, ube'emes hilo taseh. The truth is, it turned into a lav. Uma inyano lakan lahashkit pachtam ayidei tzavas mitzvahs lo tasezu. Ask the Chassam Sofer a bomb question, as we say. You're telling me this is a lo taseh? Their backs are against the wall. They're nervous that they're going to die, and now Moshe, right, tells them that that this is one of your mitzvahs that you're going to have to do ladoros. Why is he telling them now? So he basically goes on to say is that they got the mitzvah of Pesach and Milah, right, which was going to be their two mitzvahs that they had the zechus of leaving Mitzrayim. But now that they left Mitzrayim, they need another zechus, right? So when they were cornered by Paro, ukvar hisigu osamchonim alayam v'adayin lo nitztava b'shum mitzvah lasok, u'b'me'yanatzlu. They needed a zechus to be saved, right, from drowning. So he says, "V'hina isa b'svarim kisharoa adam davar iser kigon behema asura yahar aso lanu lechol." Right. So he says the Sfarim say there's a law of eating non-kosher. So how are you ever, if you don't eat non-kosher, how are you ever makayim the law of not eating non-kosher? Right. Everybody likes to ask this question. There's no asay of keeping kosher. There's being makayim a law of not eating treif. So how are you makayim this mitzvah? So what's the answer? When a person sees a cheeseburger, he should say, I really, really want to eat this, but God says I shouldn't. And ilukayim v'asei mitzvah v'alzeh nemar yashtu v'alasi ba'aver and osmu l'schar kilu ose mitzvah. And if you want to eat it and hold yourself back, you're makayim the mitzvah asay of not eating. I am now in this very, very moment, right? When your backs are against the wall and about to be drowned by the Mitzrim, right? Going to give you this commandment, this lo taseh, I want you to have this hearer of wanting to see them and knowing that you're not going to see them anymore. And that is going to be Makayim Val Pizeh, Shenu Kum Vase Rak Sheval Tase, even though it's really a Sheval Tase, because you're not doing anything positive, you're being Makayim the negative. Okay, I thought that was a very beautiful a very beautiful Chassam Sofer about why exactly now they decide to get this. I'm going to go another 5 minutes over, if that's okay, because I wanted to get to the third, right? Here we have our first overtime ever in 3 years, right? We've never gone 10 minutes over, but we're about to, okay? Kisavo, right? What is Kisavo talking about? If you open up Kisavo, the pasuk says "Ubaboker Tamar Mitenerev" all the way at the end of the Tochacha. It's it there, right? It's like curse after curse after curse. It says that you're going to be doubtful, you're not going to know what to do, you're going to be mixed up, right? Every day is going to get perpetually worse. And the absolute last Tochacha, okay, Perek Chavches Pasuk 68, right? This is the longest perek in all of Chumash. It says, "V'hashivcha Hashem Mitzrayim ba'aniyos b'derech asher amarti lecha lo tosif od lerosa v'hismakartem sham lo'oivecha la'avadim l'shvachos v'ein koneh." Okay, that's what the pasuk says. Rashi says, what's going on over here? Rashi says, very, very simple. He says, you're going to go back to Egypt on boats. Okay, let me just read Rashi. And you're going to want to sell yourself, okay, for right. You're going to be prisoner. You're going to be prisoners. You're going to want to be sold as slaves, but it's going to be so bad, right? No one's going to buy you. Says Rashi, "Ve'ein kona ki yigzru alecha hereg v'chilyon," because no one will buy you because they're going to be gozer on you, death and complete extermination. Okay, so that's the way we end the Tochacha. Really, really on a bad note. So that's the way, it seems like it is. I saw the Sforno, unbelievable. The Sforno says he learns the pasuk, and this is again another example of, if you never saw this before, you'll never know this. He says, you know what it means, v'hismakartem? Now that Rashi talks about the whole diktok of v'hismakartem, what that means, it doesn't mean, it means you're going to want to sell yourself, like it's reflexive, it's yourself. That's the diktuk of the word hismakartem. It's not a very common word that we use. So the Sforno says, you know what the hismakartem means? This has nothing to do with you being captives and being sold as a slave. You're not trying to sell yourself. You're trying to sell your goods. You're going back to the country that you came from in order to sell goods to make a parnasa. Sounds good, but ve'ein kona. Says the Sforno, "Ein ish mehem chafetz b'mlachtecha kedei shelo tuchal lihisparnes ba." No one will want to buy your stuff, okay, because they don't want to give you any parnasa. They don't want you to gain a foothold in the land of Mitzrayim. Okay, completely different pshat. And I just want to end with another Rabbeinu Bachai that's also a little bit off the wall. He says, let me open it up. He says, hold on. V'ismakartem sham tevakshu lihiyos nimkarim. Okay, you're going to be begged, right, to be sold as slaves. Ve'ein koneh. Zu mida tova. No, we're going to end the Tochacha, and we have Machlokes, pretty much Rashi and the Rabbeinu Bachai, how you learn it. You know what it means, ve'ein koneh? It doesn't mean that it's going to be so bad you can't even sell yourself. He says, oh, no, the zo mida tova, this is good, because no one's going to want to buy you, and you're not going to end up being a slave, because that's the ultimate, right? Remember the Gemara in Kedushin that says the absolute bottom of the barrel, right, is when you have no money, you borrow money and interest, blah, 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 and it's so bad, you have to sell yourself, right? I think it's on Kedushin Yutes or Daf Chaf. It says you have to sell yourself, and now do you sell yourself to a goy. That is the, right? It says Kama Kasha Afka Shel Ribis. I think that's how the Gemara starts off by saying how bad it is, right, to lend with ribis. You end up being poor, and you have to sell yourself, and you sell yourself to a guy. So, however, God spares us. God spares us the ultimate bizayon because no one ends up buying. So that is the third source of the prohibition of going to Mitzrayim. Questions?